this morning. My name is Frederick Emmerich. Please let me know if the sound levels are okay. If at any point the sound is too high or too low, just post a message into the chat box and I'll try to adjust accordingly. I want to make sure that you can hear everything okay. I wanted to start off today, this is our second lecture. I wanted to start off today asking you a question. We're talking about mass communication, media, culture, and we're talking about a number of key terms. Now there's a key term that we didn't really address as much as I might have liked last week, and I'd like to start off talking about that with you. Communication. Tell me, I had a quick exercise planned for our first week, and I didn't really do it. I'd like you to tell me in the chat box, please. Think of the word communication. What other words can you think of that are similar to communication that might somehow help us understand what communication is all about? In other words, in English we have many different words that start off the same way as communication does, C-O-M-M. What other words can you think of related to communication that might help us understand a little bit what communication is? Please just put your ideas right into the chat. Take a couple of minutes to do that. Good community. Okay, good. Talking with each other. How about common? We have an expression in English, things we have in common, which are things that we share, we hold together. Okay, exchange of opinion. Good way of, communication is a way of making a relationship. We have a word in English which is like community, commonwealth. Commonwealth often, it's sort of like the combination of a community and a government. Okay, when we're talking about communication, I think there's a tendency that we saw a little bit last week in our material. There's a tendency to think of communication as an exchange of objects back and forth. We use the word transmission a lot in talking about communication. And I think it's important when we talk about communication to remember it's not simply exchange back and forth of things. Certainly there is exchange, there is transfer, but there's sharing, there's reaching understanding, there's many different ways that we can frame or understand the idea of communication that have much more to do with relationships than they do with exchange of things. And I'd like to introduce today a quick definition of communication, which is by a scholar. His name is Vincent Mosco, and this definition comes, it appears in several of his works, but I'm taking it here from his book, The Political Economy of Communication. He calls communication a social process of exchange whose product is the mark or embodiment of a social relationship. In other words, he does see communication as exchange, as transfer back and forth. But that transfer back and forth is all about relationships among people. And I think this is very important to keep those two things in mind together. And if we think of the various words in English that relate to communication, common, community, commonwealth, and so on, these kinds of words help us remember that communication is all about relationship building. Now, I want to quickly review some of the terms that we went over last week. You can find these in our PowerPoint files. I believe Sayong has the files from last week. I'll send the files for this week. I'll also try to post them all to our Facebook page so you can see them there. But just very briefly, so we talked about mass communication last week. To remind you, mass communication is communication that's transmitted to large segments of the population. Now again, this word transmitted, delivered, one of the challenges in dealing with communication through mass media is that oftentimes that communication tends to feel like one-way communication, tends to feel like delivery of information from one place to another place, from one person to many other people. And we'd like to shift that understanding of communication a bit. Mass media. Mass media are the instruments or the means through which the forms of technology that we use to transmit, to send information to large numbers of people. Even as I say that, I recognize I keep jumping back and forth between this understanding of communication as transmission, delivery from one person to another person, and sharing, community building, developing understanding. It's a big challenge, and part of the challenge in seeing these two things in combination is the tendency of mass media, particularly the mass media that we relied on primarily in the 20th century, as mostly one-way media. I asked you to watch a video last week, Clay Shirky's video on the transformed media environment, and I just want to remind you about that video a little bit. I'll check the Facebook page and make sure that there's a link in there, and give that if you don't have it yet. Remember, Clay Shirky talked about a transformed media environment, an environment that is changing in the 21st century, has changed in the 21st century. One of the elements that he focused on in that video was the change from an environment in which media that are good for making groups, and these are the one-way media that transmit information to large numbers of people. He said that media for making groups, in the 20th century, he emphasized the idea that media for making groups like print media, broadcast media, and recorded media. In the 20th century, these media were separate from conversational media. Conversational media he sees as telephone and telegraph, things that allow us to talk one to another. The conversational media in the 20th century environment are media that are used by individuals or very small groups of people to hold conversations, to engage in sharing of information, to reaching shared understanding. Whereas group creating media tend to be more one way, tend to allow a person or a group of people who control the media to deliver their messages to large groups of people who cannot really talk back. He signals in the 21st century, in an environment largely conditioned by the growth of the internet, that now the difference between conversational and group-making media is disappearing. In other words, we now have a media environment in which all these different kind of media are available to us simultaneously through the internet, through platforms that allow us to quickly switch from one to another. And this is changing the relationship between the producers of media and consumers of media. Now more and more of us are both producers and consumers of media. We're people who can share and create information, as well as people who use information produced by others. Culture is a very important concept for us in this course. Remember that culture is a historically transmitted pattern of meanings. It's about symbols, making of meaning through symbols and ideas. Another way to put this, culture is the expressed and shared values, attitudes, beliefs, and practices of a social group, organization, or institution. And we talked a little bit about the idea of cultural periods, about times that are marked by particular ways of understanding the world through culture and technology. Clay Shirky's argument about the development of the transformation of the media environment is all about this understanding of cultural periods as conditioned by culture and technology. So we're living, from Shirky's perspective, we're living through a cultural moment right now in which our ways of communicating are changing, and effective communication in this period means understanding those changes and responding to them. He gave us some examples in his video of ways that people, either that large groups of people were able to effectively engage in that media ecosystem, and also in discussing Barack Obama's website, he indicated ways that people in leadership positions need to respond differently in order to effectively engage in this environment. A few other concepts I'd like to quickly review for you. Convergence. Remember, convergence is the idea of, the word convergence means coming together at a point. Convergence can happen, when we talk about convergence, we're talking about technological convergence, the coming together of technologies. And for Shirky, this would be, for example, the internet as a technology has helped to bring together many communication technologies that previously, were distinct technologies. In the 20th century, broadcast media were separate from print media, were separate from recorded media. now in the 21st century, all those previously separate technologies are blending together where they can all be used in one space and can be, and effectively, the distinctions between those types of media are disappearing in many ways. We talked about free speech as a culturally conditioned value, and particularly we talked about free speech with respect to the United States. We talked about propaganda. Propaganda is an example of communication that rather than being meant to reach a shared understanding with someone, propaganda is communication that is meant to manipulate people, to get them to believe something, even if it's not true, even if it's not in their best interests. Gatekeepers. We talked a little bit about the idea of gatekeepers. In the 20th century media environment, the one that Shirky initially described for us, mass media played a very important role in making choices about what information should get to people. And because those mass media were dominant, because those mass media had such a strong effect on what information got to communities of people, this was an incredibly important role played by mass media. Currently, media scholars see the gatekeeping role of large media organizations like broadcasters and print media as not quite disappearing. It's not that it's not important, but because there are so many more avenues through which ideas can enter the public discourse, the role of mass media as gatekeepers is reduced. We talked a little bit about tastemakers, the idea of mass media as institutions that help to promote interest in certain kinds of things. And the specific example that we discussed a little bit, and I asked you to watch a couple of videos that Ken Harvey has posted to our Facebook group, was the Ed Sullivan Show in the United States. The Ed Sullivan Show was very popular, particularly in the 1960s in the United States, and was known as a television program through which aspiring musical groups could get attention of audiences and become very popular very quickly. Finally, media literacy. Media literacy is a process through which people understand how media work and learn to work with media. Now, I think Clay Shirky's video is a very good example of reading media, of understanding media and how they're working in ways that can help us be media literate. If the media environment, if we live in a transformed media environment, understanding what it is about that environment that's changing, that's significant. He signaled several things. He signaled two-way communication. He signaled the mixing of different media in the same platform, convergence of media. He signaled the ability of large numbers of people to communicate not just with large audiences, not just with people who formerly were broadcasters, not just talking back to broadcasters, but communicating one to another. Those have been changes that have made had a tremendous impact on the media environment that we live in today. Media literacy, like literacy in general, is all about understanding a particular communication environment so that you can act effectively within that environment. And Shirky's video is a very good example of looking at our contemporary media environment, understanding how it works, and not just for the sake of understanding, but for the sake of using it effectively, for becoming effective communicators. And that's at heart, that's what the idea of media literacy is all about. Okay, let's proceed with our discussion of media effects. When we talk about media effects, what we're talking about are the ways that mass media have an impact on people. Now, the idea of, or the question of how media affect people has been one of the key questions for media scholarship since the rise of communication studies. Communication studies emerged essentially along with the broadcast industry in the early 1900s. Media effects, the idea of understanding media effects is the idea that if we want to use mass media effectively, if we want to use mass media and make the most of them, we need to understand how we can influence other people, or how people respond to the messages that they see in mass media. You may be familiar with this now. I guess now it's a couple of years ago. This is a line from the Lego movie where a character turns to the camera, says, "Hi everybody, you may not know me, but I'm on TV, so you can trust me." This quote, I think what's funny about this quote is it speaks to our understanding of what television is. I'm on TV, so you can trust me. It's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek way of addressing the ways that television, that some people think television and other mass media can influence us by reducing our sense of distrust of people, by giving power to the people who are using mass media to speak to us. There's a very famous case in communication studies from the early 1930s. Orson Welles was a famous movie actor, director. In 1938, he created a radio production of a science fiction story, War of the Worlds. And this production, it aired on Halloween night, 1938. And the production became quite famous as an example of people reacting to media in ways that may be inappropriate, but suggested the influence that media can have. This television program was listened to by many people who didn't understand that it was a fictional story. They thought that the Earth was really being invaded by aliens, and it caused a panic in much of the United States. It's become a case study that in looking at how people respond to mass media. I want to distinguish between propaganda and persuasion. When we talk about propaganda, we're talking about manipulation of information to influence public opinion. Propaganda, the idea of propaganda assumes that mass media are very powerful, that mass media can act as, if you know what a megaphone is a device, looks like a cone. Sometimes they're electric also. They can use power to increase someone's voice, but oftentimes it's just a tube that you speak through, small at the end where your mouth is and big out there. You speak through it and it amplifies your voice. The idea of propaganda is the idea that we can create messages. If you know how to create the perfect message, and if you have the proper medium through which to deliver the message, in other words, the proper amplification system to make your message louder, more prominent, then you can influence people to do almost anything. This is an idea that was very salient in the 1930s, 1940s in media studies, and this had a lot to do with what was happening in the world at that time, particularly the rise of the Nazis in Germany, and the rise of other great powers, the Soviet Union, and even Western media, all were using techniques, were studying propaganda techniques, studying ways of influencing people using mass media, because there was an understanding that particularly the new broadcast media, but not just broadcast media, were very powerful tools through which to influence large groups of people. Okay. Persuasion is distinct from propaganda. Propaganda assumes that people are relatively weak, audiences are relatively weak, and that communicators, in dealing with people, communicators are just looking for the proper keys, the proper ways to change people's beliefs. With persuasion, persuasion is also an attempt to influence people, but it's more an attempt to influence people that recognizes that people have power. People are sentient beings, and people need to, if you want to change someone's mind, you need to appeal to their reason and reach a shared understanding with them. So there's a strong distinction in communication studies between the idea of propaganda and the idea of persuasion. There have been many different studies on media effects. There have been some very important areas of concern. Media effects studies have looked at violence in media. For example, some studies have looked at how often people are exposed to violent acts in media. For example, looking at cartoons or movies and counting the number of violent acts that someone sees in those media, and have tried to extrapolate from that, have tried to get a sense of whether, for example, seeing lots of violence in media desensitizes us, makes us more prone to accepting violence in our actual lives. Similarly, studies have looked at exposure to sexual imagery or imagery of different cultural values in order to understand whether, when we're exposed to those through mass media, they change our systems of values understanding. One of the most important studies in mass media, which I didn't media effects studies, which I didn't put into this short list here, was a study by Harold Laswell that looks at election behavior, voting behavior by people. So voting, how people are influenced by media to cast a vote is a very important, another very important category of media effects in media effects research. You may have seen, if you watch or follow coverage of political campaigns, polls are used quite a bit to understand the preferences of voters in political campaigns, and this is part of understanding. Now, many of those polls are used to try to gauge the effect of media on voters. There are different theories about how media affect people. And those theories have themselves developed in response to particular cultural periods, or maybe not in response to those periods, but within particular cultural periods. Theories of media effects. Now, a theory is a systematic understanding of a systematic explanation of how something works that helps us understand not just why it worked that way, but hopefully to help us predict how it may work in the future. So theories of media effects are theories that try to help explain the impact that mass media have on people, and also help to try to predict the impact that mass media may have on people. This has been particularly important in media industries, for example, in advertising. If you want to get people to pay for advertising, and advertising is very expensive, if you want to get people to pay for advertising, you have to be able to tell them that it will be worth their while. To tell them that the advertising that they create can have an actual impact, an actual effect on an audience, to get them to believe something or behave in a particular way. Theories of media effects are ideas that try to help explain these phenomena, explain how it is that people respond to mass media, and they're often used to help justify spending on advertising. Okay, a few of the key theories. Now, as we go through these theories, I present them chronologically. And it's important that we're presenting them chronologically because they're responsive to the particular cultural periods in which they're developed. Okay, direct effect, the theory of direct effects. Sometimes this is also called the hypodermic theory or the magic bullet theory. Now picture this, a hypodermic needle. You've all probably gone to the doctor, you've had inoculations, shots that are supposed to protect you against illnesses. The theory of direct effects is the idea that that mass media as powerful tools, mass media are tools for delivering messages to audiences. And that, as I said before, and this is the theory of direct effects is strongly associated with ideas like propaganda. It's the idea that if you have the right message delivered through the right medium, you can directly affect the perceptions, beliefs, behavior of audiences. This assumes that mass media are very strong, very powerful, and that audiences are relatively weak. It assumes that as audiences, when we receive messages, we can be strongly influenced, particularly by those messages. And this was a very powerful idea, particularly in the 1930s and early 1940s. There was lots and lots of research went into trying to understand how mass media work and how mass media can be used to directly to influence audiences. A number of prominent books were written on propaganda, on ways to influence people without regard for the interests that they had. Over time, communication scholars saw that this theory didn't really work. There wasn't really a way to frame a perfect message. It was very difficult to explain, for example, how it was that Hitler came to power in Germany. But people who have studied that have understood that you can't reduce that phenomenon simply to use of mass media. Life is much more complex than that. And if you want to understand how Hitler came to power, how fascists came to power, how governments influence people, you have to understand a much more complex array of issues than just what are the messages that are delivered to people. A study that was developed, now this is the People's Choice study. This is the study by Harold Laswell that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. This was a study of voting behavior, of how people's opinions, how people formed their opinions in a voting campaign. And this is the two-step, later the n-step theory, which looked at how people responded to mass media messages. And they started to realize in this campaign, when people watched voting messages, they would watch them, but it wasn't just the message itself that people responded to. And the best way that they could come to explain it was that people would listen to mass media messages, would absorb them, but they wouldn't interpret them simply by watching that message. They'd interpret them with reference to what this study came to call opinion leaders. In other words, we each have people we trust or institutions we trust who we rely on to help us understand, to help us interpret mass media messages. Now, essentially what this study said was, yes, people receive mass media messages, but people have pre-existing sense of who they trust, who they rely on to help them interpret the complex messages that they receive in society, and that mass media messages were something that they interpreted with reference to opinion leaders. Now, the two-step theory suggested each of us has an opinion leader that we turn to. The n-step theory said it's even more complex than that. It's not just that we have an opinion leader we turn to. It's that we have many different sources who we personally choose that influence our thinking on things that we see in mass media. Now, this theory assumes, whereas the direct effects theory assumes that mass media are strong and audiences are weak. The two-step and the n-step theory sort of turn this on its head, and they say media are actually relatively weak when it comes to influencing people, and the audiences themselves are relatively strong because the audiences, the people in the audience, make choices about how they're going to be influenced. It's not the media themselves that have a strong influence over people. It's the array of choices that individuals in the audience make that condition what impact mass media will have on them. A little bit later on, another theory came up called uses and gratifications. Now, this theory suggested that when we use mass media, each of us as individuals are making choices. We have things that we're doing with mass media. We may want to be informed. We may want to be entertained. We may want to have certain kinds of information for certain purposes. This uses and gratifications says people use mass media to fulfill their needs. It's not the media themselves that condition what we do, what we watch. It's our own particular needs that lead us to make decisions about how we use mass media. Now, this is a different kind of an approach. Again, assumes audiences are relatively strong, media relatively weak. There's a scholar, he's a very interesting person. He was Canadian, and he wasn't trained as a communications scholar. His actual field was more related to medieval studies, but he developed a theory in the 1960s, which we still, that this theory is elements of it still are heard today. He had a book called "The Medium is the Massage," and we often hear the phrase. It's often expressed, the media is the message. His idea was that media are extensions of our physiology. In other words, the television, the camera is an extension of the eye. The radio is an extension of the ear. He saw mass media as simply technologies that helped us, that helped extend our senses and our capacities, including voice, not just receiving capacities, but also sending capacities, and allowed us to communicate much more broadly. Much more broadly than just human interaction without mass media. He saw electronic media, especially television, as creating what he called a global village, a world in which which was a smaller place, because through the images of television we could feel as if we were connected to people, no matter how far away they were. McLuhan has had a much stronger cultural influence than a theoretical influence. His ideas, as I said, he wasn't a communication scholar, and his ideas were only a little bit influential in communication scholarship, but they've been very influential in our cultural sense of mass media and what mass media do to us, and this can be actually quite significant. You don't hear many terms from communication theory coming up in contemporary discourse on media. You do hear several terms developed by McLuhan coming up in that discourse. So we can't discount the influence that Marshall McLuhan has had in changing our thinking, changing our understanding about what media are and what media do. Another theory from the 1960s is agenda setting theory. Agenda setting theory is the idea that that we cannot discount the power of media. Mass media have a big influence on people, this theory suggests. It acknowledges that, for example, that uses and gratifications theory, and two-step theory are valid. That we aren't simply passive receivers of information who are easily influenced. But what agenda setting theory says is mass media, there are people in mass media who make choices. They make choices about what we see and what we hear. An editor in a newsroom makes choices about what stories to cover, what's important, who's important to talk to, who matters in society. And in making those choices, they reduce the range of information that audiences see. This is an incredibly important role for mass media. Remember the concept we talked about last week and again a little bit earlier today, gatekeeping. Gatekeeping is the idea that editors in media industries are making choices about what gets seen, what doesn't get seen. They make choices about what gets through to audiences. In making those choices, they reduce the range of ideas that are put through this megaphone of mass media, and call our attention to those ideas. In other words, agenda setting theory tells us mass media may not tell us what to think, and in fact they can't tell us what to think, but mass media do tell us what to think about. Now, an example, a particularly salient example for Americans, and probably for many people worldwide, given the influence of the United States, is a study that was done recently about coverage of the television news of the current presidential campaign in the United States. And this study showed that the three big television broadcasters in the United States, ABC, CBS, and NBC, had given much more coverage, much more time covering the campaign of Donald Trump for president than any of the other people who were campaigning for the presidency. They gave more time to Trump than they did to Hillary Clinton, to Bernie Sanders, to any of the other presidential contenders. Agenda setting theory would tell us, given this study, agenda setting theory would say that mass media can't and aren't able to tell people what they should think about Donald Trump or about any of the other campaign hopefuls, but they are able to tell people what to think about. And in this sense, we might say, if Trump is getting lots more coverage than the other candidates, then people will think more, focus more attention on Donald Trump than on other candidates. And if they're focusing more attention on Donald Trump, the concern is this may have an influence over how people cast their votes. Now, this is the challenge of agenda setting theory. Agenda setting theory would say, there may be lots of coverage of Donald Trump. That will make people think much more about Donald Trump, but whether they think about him in a positive or a negative way is a much more complex issue, and mass media themselves cannot control that. There's a theory, and we'll jump back a little bit to the 1930s, a theory called symbolic interactionism. Symbolic interactionism is the idea that we as individuals develop culturally through engagement in symbols, and that mass media are a key element in understanding and engaging with cultural symbols. This is a theory that is, I guess we could say it's sort of a background theory in mass media. It's more a theory of psychology than mass media itself. It has had some influence in communication theory, but not as central as some of the other theories that we've mentioned. A number of other theories are useful. They're less central in communication theory, or less influential in communication theory, but they're important to be aware of. There's a theory called spiral of silence, which says we have a society out there, and what mass media do is they reflect society. They amplify the dominant voices in society, and they shut out the minor voices in society. This is a kind of a twist on agenda setting theory. Agenda setting theory says media tell us, don't tell us what to think, they tell us what to think about. This spiral of silence theory sees mass media as part of the culturally dominant institutions in society, and suggests that by their nature, dominant mass media will focus on dominant voices. We'll hear more from mainstream political figures, mainstream entertainment figures, so on and so forth. The people who are already dominant in society will become more powerful as their voices are amplified through mass media, whereas people with less power, people with less influence, over time become less influential as media ignore what they're saying. Now, this is a critique of the role of media that I think is particularly salient. At the same time, it's open to challenge. Similarly, media logic. This is an idea that the logic of media formats, news, comedy, drama, and so on, provides a particular kind of framework through which we understand messages. Think of the organization of news programs. The typical news program has a voice of authority presenting information to us. The information focuses on sitting governments or on prominent contenders for positions of power. There's a logic to this. For many people, there's a logic to this that tends to reinforce the ways that society is already organized. Cultivation analysis. This is a theory that suggests that repetition is very important in the ways that media influence people. Media influence us by repetition of common messages that tend to cultivate attitudes of the audience. This is another one that suggests that media are strong and audiences are weak. And in fact, each of these, the spiral of silence, media logic, and cultivation analysis, are all theories that try to focus again on the strength of media. They assume that mass media have a strong impact on us, and if there are theories that say that media don't have direct effect on us, they're looking for ways to suggest that there's still a strong impact, even if it's not direct impact of a particular message. There are ways that media behave in society that, for example, that shut out voices, or that work on us by repeating messages over and over again, that do have a strong influence on us. So these three really reinforce the idea. They look for ways to reinforce the idea of the strength of media in having an influence on audiences. Methods of media research. The term research methods is very important to academics. Other people may hear it from time to time. It's important to journalists and other people, but essentially it just means methods of research just means how it is that we go about how it is that we go about gathering information and developing an understanding of something. So methods of media research are ways that we go about learning about mass media, learning about whatever it is that we want to know about mass media. There are different types of research. Two major categories. I haven't written them down in the slides here. The two major categories of research are quantitative, like numbers, quantity, and qualitative. Quantitative research is research that relies on developing numbers, things you can count. This tends to be research that's driven by large amounts of data, like surveys where you ask questions of many people. Qualitative research is research that looks at human understanding of things. Qualitative research would be more involved with, for example, with doing in-depth conversational interviews of people for developing understanding. Okay, so let me go through some of the some of the key methods of media research. There's a method called content analysis. Content analysis basically involves identifying things in mass media that can be counted and then keeping track of how often they appear. I mentioned a few minutes ago the television news coverage of the study of television news coverage of various presidential candidates. This was probably a study that was done using content analysis, and it would involve, for example, having people over time watch the television news coverage of the presidential campaigns and then keeping track of how many minutes of coverage was given to one candidate or another candidate or another candidate over time, and then counting all that data and presenting it. So the study that I referred to found that there were far more minutes of coverage given to Donald Trump than to the other presidential candidates. This is a useful research method. It's useful information for us to have. How we interpret it is another question, and perhaps much more complicated. This approach, content analysis, can be used in many different ways. You could look at a website and decide, and look at a website in terms of how many links to stories there were. You could look at at news coverage, at print news coverage, and count how many sources were cited that were members of mainstream power groups, government and big business, and how many were community leaders, that sort of thing. These sorts of approaches can all be used and have been used to try to understand what's going on with mass media. Archival research is often done with newspapers, magazines, television broadcasts. This involves going into archives or libraries and looking back at historical documents. This can be done using content analysis, looking at old television footage, for example, or it can be done in a more historical or qualitative way. Surveys. A survey is a qualitative, a survey is a quantitative research method in which you develop a set of questions, and generally these are questions that allow you to select one of a number of options for each question. The survey is conducted with a large number of people, and then the results of the survey are expressed in a quantitative way, I confused myself, in a quantitative way. In other words, when we do surveys, the reports, the results that we get back from the surveys are often expressed as percentages of the population. A survey on a presidential poll may say 62% of the voters prefer this candidate versus 38% of the voters who prefer the other candidate. There's a form of research called social role analysis. This is more a qualitative approach that looks at people in mass media in terms of the roles they fill in society, and tries to suggest something about the impact of mass media based on the presence of those people. Social role analysis is not as prominent an approach, not as prominent a method as the others that we've talked about so far, excuse me. Some qualitative methods. In-depth interviews. In-depth interviews, basically, you develop a set of questions, but they're questions that are supposed to inspire some form of conversation. And conduct detailed interviews for people. In other words, if you want to learn about the effects of mass media, one way to do that is to talk to people who watch mass media. I've had students who do master's theses who want to find out how people respond to particular mass media images, and so they do it by developing questions and then talking detailed, open-ended questions with people to understand what their perceptions are. Rhetorical analysis is analysis of communication styles. For example, we may look at news programs, and people have actually people have looked at different news media, and in terms of the language that they use, in terms of grammar, that sort of thing, how they express themselves in order to reach a particular audience. If any of you are familiar with newspapers in New York City, the New York Times is a very prominent newspaper on the world scene. It's written in a very formal way. Rhetorically tends to try to reach people who are well educated. Rhetorical analyses have looked at this and compared it to some other New York City newspapers like the New York Post or the Daily News, which are, those papers are considered more tabloid papers trying to reach less educated audiences. Oftentimes those newspapers don't even bother using complete sentences. They may refer to the president using a colloquial term, Prez, P-R-E-Z, which you would never find in the New York Times. So rhetorical analysis is something that can look at linguistic styles, the styles in which messages are presented, and draw some connotations from that. A focus group is another kind of a qualitative method. A focus group is basically like an in-depth interview, except instead of conducting it with one person, you conduct it with many people in a group at a time. An advantage to this approach is that it gets people thinking together. If communication is a community building experience, developing an understanding of communication may benefit from conversations that happen within communities. So for example, if I conduct an interview with one person on a particular topic, they may give me the responses that they have in mind at that moment. If I have a conversation with several people at once, things that one person says may spark an idea for another person. Right? The idea of focus groups is that it's useful to put a number of people together to discuss something in order to get them thinking together, sharing ideas, because we can reach a better, fuller understanding of the thing we're studying in that way. Experiments are controlled ways of conducting research in order to see how people respond to them. There's a very famous series of research studies done in the United States. In fact, they're so famous that they almost have mythological status. There was a series of studies done to look at how people were influenced by someone who was instructing them to do something, to punish someone for their response to a question. So they put a test subject in one room and another person in another room. They brought in the test subject and said, your role here is to help the other person learn by punishing them when they get a question wrong. We think that if they take a test, if they get the question wrong, we punish them by administering an electric shock. Now, this study was really to find out how far they could make a person go in delivering punishment. Right? We don't need to go into a lot of detail about this, but essentially, what an experiment does is it tries to set up an artificial situation in order to see how people respond to it. With mass media, you could do this in response to particular media messages. The advertising industries do this quite a bit. When they have television commercials are quite expensive, so oftentimes they put together groups of people and try to see how they respond to the messages. Participant observation. This is another qualitative approach. This is an approach where someone becomes part of the community that they're studying and observes the community at the same time that they're part of that community. It's a way of developing a deeper understanding of what's happening in that community. there are some problems with theories and methods of mass communication. I think it's important, it's a part of our development of media literacy is to develop an understanding, not just an understanding of media, but an understanding of our understanding of media. Think of it this way. We talked a little bit about the idea of the global village, the idea that mass media change our relationship with people worldwide by making it feel to us, at least, like we're all part of the same small community. It's useful for us to consider how this idea might have an impact on our further understanding. For example, if we start talking about ourselves as living in a global village, does that allow us to forget, to push aside our knowledge of the world as being made up of people with differing levels of power? Does that make us forget that the people who have control of communication technologies are in a position of power that people without that control don't have? It's very important in talking about mass media to try to really focus attention on what theories of mass communication are really telling us and how those might best be used to further our understanding of what mass media do to us or what we do with mass media. Another problem with theories or methods of mass media, oftentimes we assume things about a media audience. Sometimes we assume that audiences are passive, right? Audiences are easily manipulated. A professor I had who'd been involved in a number of prominent research studies in the 1970s and 1980s pointed out to us often that there have been a number of studies of mass media done that suggest that many of us believe that other people are very heavily influenced by things that they see in mass media, whereas we ourselves are not. In other words, when we watch television, when we watch movies, when we read newspapers, we ourselves have the sense that we aren't easily influenced, that we're thinking sentient, that we're in control. But we assume that other people are easily influenced. And this is something that could suggest a certain bias or a certain tendency to want to try to control messages in media because we're concerned that other people may be excessively influenced by them. Some other kinds of problems that come up in dealing with media theories. So for example, the agenda setting theory. The agenda setting theory tells us that media don't tell us what to think, they tell us what to think about. They don't really tell us who sets the agenda for media. Who sets the agenda for whom? If media industries are are setting the agenda for the public, who's setting the agenda for media industries, who's setting the agenda for somebody else. There are weak points in certain theories that need to be explored. Another one, uses and gratifications theory. Uses and gratifications theory assumes that mass media fulfill particular needs. What if we aren't using them to fulfill needs? What if we're, it's not, critics have said it's not always the case that media are fulfilling needs. There may be something else going on. Spiral of silence is a theory, and one of the criticisms of spiral of silence is it's very general. It's a weak theory. It doesn't explain enough, doesn't account for things like people who are nonconformists. What I do with this is I'm raising some of the criticisms that come up about various theories and methods of mass media, because none of these theories or methods none of the theories of mass media is really the final word. Right? There's negotiation. There is a process of trying to convince people of a theory that goes on with all theories. All theories are subject to challenge. All theories are subject to critique. All theories are subject to criticism. Okay? The mass media theories are ideas that attempt to help explain how mass media work in society. And because what they're attempting to do is to isolate a particular phenomenon, mass media, mass communication, that operates within a much wider sphere of social life and cultural life. And it's very difficult to isolate in that way. So this is part of the complexity of dealing with media theories. Now, as you think about the theories and methods that we've talked about today, try to keep in mind these are ways that we approach media. There's been a change over time in the theories that have been dominant in mass communication studies. These changes have come about partly as a result of changes in communication technology. Right? With the development of broadcast technology, people became aware that broadcast technology was a much more immersive experience than previous print and recorded media. Broadcast technology had such an impact on people that scholars focused on that increased impact and focused on the strength of media, the opportunity that mass media had to influence people. And that explains a lot of the development of propaganda studies and the idea of the theory of direct effect of media. As we became used to broadcasting, we started to realize it didn't quite work that way. And communication studies since then have come up with theories that are a bit more nuanced, perhaps a bit more frustrating. It might be really easy for us if we were able to say mass media affect us directly. It's not that easy. So please, as you review these, try to approach them with a sense of trying to understand a little bit about each theory, about what it's saying, and about how that theory connects to its cultural environment. Okay. That's all I have for coverage on Chapter 2 for this week. I think probably we'll take a break now. Let me see. Ken, are you there? And are you, would you like students to take a break at this point, or what would you like to do? Okay, I'll sign off now so that Ken can get into the communication channel. I hope everybody has a good
Okay. First off, can you hear me okay? We're transitioning. I also changed from my headset to a freestanding microphone. Everybody hear me okay? Okay. Thank you. I want to kind of proceed with, let me try this other way, with some of the topics that, sorry, I will try to speak more slowly. Some of the topics that Frederick already touched on, but from a little different perspective. I've been in the news business most of my life, and so I may see things a little bit differently. Plus, I'm somewhat politically, kind of a political renegade compared to other both journalists and academics, and I'll get back to that in a second. But so I probably have somewhat a different perspective on some things, and would challenge some of the things that some academics would have concluded. But I'm going to start with this idea of communications within the relationship environment, that it's hard to break it apart from relationship. And I totally agree with that concept. For example, there was a study done in various newspaper newsrooms about how journalists were orienting their stories, how they're writing their news stories. And what they found was that those newsrooms where there was a very strong, demanding editor, the reporters kind of wrote to him. That's who they had in mind when they were writing, because they knew they'd be criticized if they did not write the way the editor wanted them to write. On the other hand, in an editor or in a newsroom with a weak editor, an editor that pretty much let the reporters do what they wanted to do, they found that reporters kind of started to see themselves like white knights out to avenge the negative things in society, and to right the wrongs, and protect the damsels in distress, and so forth. And so they had a different image. They were writing to somebody else in their mind. I frequently refer to that in my news writing classes to explain to students that in my case, I try to have my students write something that can actually appear in print. So I have them write for our student newspaper, or for I started an online student newspaper, so that my students would know that they were writing to a real audience and not just to me. Because while I wanted them to think about what I taught them as they write, I also wanted them to experience and to consider that they weren't writing to me only. They were writing to a larger audience. Another study was a study of editorial writers. Now, editorial writers, that means those who write opinion pieces. In an American newspaper, particularly the daily newspapers, they will have an editorial board. On the editorial board will be the publisher, the executive editor. Okay. Do I really speak a lot faster than Frederick? I didn't know that. I'm really slow for me. Anyway, the editorial board, like I said, includes the publisher, the various top editors, whatever their title might be, executive editor, managing editor, and so forth. And they get together and they decide what the opinion of the newspaper is. They don't always agree, but they ultimately come to a conclusion. Who should our newspaper support for president? What should we support as far as some community issue goes? And sometimes none of them write the editorial, write the opinion piece for the newspaper. Rather, they hire somebody. They hire an editorial writer who does the writing. The editorial writer may not always agree with what the editorial board decided. And so one studied how does that impact how an editorial writer writes when he agrees with something or he doesn't agree with it. It probably came out just the opposite of what you would think. When an editorial writer writes what he agrees with, he tends to take a more careful and he tries to bring those who disagree with him very carefully to his way of thinking. And so it doesn't come across real harsh, real, demanding that you agree with me in that sense. That anybody who doesn't agree with me is an idiot sort of approach. No. Whereas if they don't agree with it, they do tend to write that way. They do tend to write as if, in a very harsh way, a way that this is the only way you can think, even though they don't think that way. So who are they writing to? Well, if they agree with the opinion, they're truly writing to the audience. And they know that some people in the audience don't agree with them. And so they're trying to carefully bring them from disagreement to agreement. On the other hand, if they disagree with what the editorial board said they had to write about, or the conclusion they had to come to, they're really writing to the editorial board. They're not writing to the audience then. They're writing to the editorial board and writing in what they think the editorial board wants to hear, which is a definitive statement of what is right or wrong, according to the editorial board. So they have found in studies that the way we write is dependent on who we're writing to, who we have in our mind. It may even be a fictitious person. I mentioned the reporters thinking themselves like a white knight avenging the wrongs. They may have a fictitious person in their mind who they're writing to. Anyway, so it's interesting. It is a social, you can't talk about communications without talking about the relationships, the social environment, the way, who we writing to. We don't write to ourselves. We write to somebody, even if we don't know who that somebody is, as if we're a newspaper reporter. The other thing I was going to mention, that audience does impact even the traditional media. Even when I started my career, which was in 1973. You see, that's a long, long time. I started at a newspaper, a big city newspaper. It was a weekly newspaper, however, in competition with two daily newspapers in Tampa, Florida. And we had about 120,000, between 100 and 120,000 circulation, actually quite a bit more than the daily newspapers. But our paper was free delivery. We gave it out to anybody free, whereas the daily papers were received only by those who paid a subscription fee. So we didn't, even though we gave away more, we didn't know for sure how much people were reading our paper. And indeed, we had to presume that many of them did not read our newspaper. So in trying, of course, as a business, when we sell advertising, what we're really selling is readers. And so we need to get as many readers as possible. So my perspective as editor was to write about the most interesting things, the things that most people would want to read, not to write about things that are somewhat boring. And so that was my perspective as editor. Sometimes we wrote about things that were controversial, some things that some people didn't want us to write about, particularly maybe some of the community leaders might not want us to write about certain things, but I felt like our readers did want to hear those things. It was a different perspective than the daily papers were giving them, for example. So we became a little bit controversial, particularly among community leaders, for writing about things that sometimes they did not agree with or did not want us to write about. Well, meanwhile, I was editor, and another young man, only about my own age, was general manager, but he was the owner's son, so he had more power than as a general manager. He was the owner's son. He was going to meetings, what we call service club meetings, Kiwanis, Rotary, Lions clubs, and he belonged to a couple of these, and some of his friends at these service clubs convinced him that we were alienating people by writing about controversial things. Now that was their perspective, but they were leaders. They were some of the leaders of community who did not like some of the things we were writing about, but they did not necessarily represent the majority of readers. Nonetheless, the general manager declared that we were no longer going to write anything controversial. I was not upset. I knew he and his father had the right to do anything they wanted to do. But I told him, you're going to destroy the newspaper. The newspaper depends on readers. I'm bringing you readers. You do what you want to do. He said, write about schools, but there's hundreds of schools in that area. Wanted to write about Boy Scouts. Well, which Boy Scouts would you write about? There's no way to write the sort of things that he wanted to write and get a large audience to read it. So I gave him like 4 months notice, but I went ahead and decided I would go someplace else. And I bought my own newspaper at that point and moved across the country to Washington. So I was replaced by another mutual friend. And so I continued to communicate with the new editor of the newspaper. And within 4 months of when I left, the newspaper did lose lots and lots of advertising. And so they made the business decision to become even more controversial than I was, because they needed readers, and they had lost their readership by the general manager believing what 4 of his friends told him. 4 friends caused the change in that newspaper that ultimately destroyed it, as I warned it would. They ultimately very soon had to sell the newspaper because they had lost their readership and lost their advertising. So even that many years ago in 1973, the audience, in this case, you might say they're more than audience because they're influential leaders in the community. But I've seen also in other situations where, in a daily newspaper I worked at in Washington, where just a few letters to the editor would get the editors to change something because they thought those few letters they received from the audience must represent a larger proportion of the audience than just those 3 or 4 letters, which may or may not be true. So there are influences going on within the newsroom. How strong is your editor? Who's the person that really influences other people? There's influences going on between the newspaper and the audience, or the broadcast TV station and the audience. Lots of things going on that are not always accounted for in some of the theories that Frederick talked about. So I ask myself sometimes, who do you communicate with, and who do we communicate in class? If you're as I mentioned, if I have students write a story, I don't want them to write it to me. I want them to write it to an audience, although I want them to remember what I taught them. In the social media, if you're posting something, who do you have in your mind when you post something funny or political? Do you have a friend in mind, or is it just this invisible audience, or whatever? But when you're speaking in the public, when I'm doing public speaking, I like to find some of the audience who really is responding well to what I'm saying, and I speak a lot to them. I look at them a lot because I see a smile on their face. I see them shaking their head, yes, 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 and so that encourages me. It probably gets me to speak too long and too fast because one person in the audience or 2 people in the audience are really responding well to me, and so I feel like I do better when I look at that person or those people. Well, now let me bring up another couple of questions here, again, that kind of build on this idea. First off, what is truth? And how do we know what is true? How do we know what we know? And why do we think what we think? This was part of my master's thesis many years ago. I studied this concept that we call dogmatism. I don't know if you know what dogmatism is, but it suggests that that we're overly tied to a certain dogma, a certain belief. But as I studied this concept, the sociological concept of dogmatism, I looked at the test that the social scientists who kind of pushed this concept had created to decide whether somebody was dogmatic or not dogmatic. Now the concept, as the general person understands it, you might say is opinionated. Somebody who's very, very opinionated and maybe closed-minded. Somebody who's dogmatic might be considered closed-minded, that they don't listen to other people. They have one serious thought, and they're sure they're right. First off, before I address my thesis, the truth is we know very little. Religiously, the culture you grow up in, the family you grow up in, is going to probably dictate in 99% of the cases what religious beliefs you're gonna hold as an adult. And it's not just religion, other values, other core values, whether they're religious or educational or political, whatever they might be. When you grow up in an environment of people saying, this is true, this is true, this is true, you grow up thinking, this must be true, this must be true, this must be true. And indeed, your family might interact with other families with the same concept. You may go to a school that has where the teachers hold the same values and the same ideas. And so one might conclude, everybody I know who's smart, everybody whose opinion I respect, believes this. Therefore, it must be true. Everybody I know who is reasonable, rational, who I respect, believes what I now believe. So it must be true. And yet, in every country we have a different culture, and in many countries, or there's different religious values across the world. I'm a Christian. I live now in a Muslim country, and it's interesting to see how different people think in this culture than the average person in America. Who the typical person in America is Christian or Christian oriented. They may not be active in a church, but they're Christian oriented. Whereas the average person here is not real active Muslim, but they're traditional Muslim. The Muslim religion survived in Kazakhstan despite the Soviet Union trying to do away with all religion. It survived, but more as a tradition than as an active religion. And so most of the Muslims here don't go to mosque very often, kind of like Catholics in Latin America. Catholicism controls, as a religion, controls most of Latin America, Mexico, and Brazil, and Argentina, and everything in between. Catholicism is the dominant religion there. But a lot of people never go to the Catholic cathedral, but they grew up with that tradition. So it's not just in religion. Again, politically and lots of other values we hold, and we are convinced it must be right because people around us say it's right. This leads to another concept. Some people have shown examples where people get surrounded by a group of people who think like they do. So it's a subset. It's not the entire culture. It's just a smaller group within that society. Some people think that Richard Nixon, who had to resign as president of the United States, made bad decisions because he was surrounded by people that all thought alike and who all thought that the Democrats, the other party, were conspiring against them, and they were a little bit paranoid. And so the whole Watergate, if you remember that at all, from history, where that led to Nixon having to resign, was caused because they were so paranoid about what the other party, the Democrat Party, might be doing. And so a groupthink, sometimes you can get a subset within the culture, and that group can make you think a certain way, can influence you a certain way, and your thought process is kind of, everybody I respect agrees with me, therefore I must be right. This must be the right thinking. Well, so this is on the background of my thesis. And so among other things in my thesis, I did actually 4 national surveys. I did a survey of journalists from magazines from the 2 extremes, the ones that the founder of the dogmatism concept would say would be more likely to be dogmatic. So very liberal magazines and very conservative magazines. I got them to share their readership list with me, or to mail out my surveys for me. I also did a survey of those journalists from very liberal, the 2 extremes, the very extreme liberal and the extreme conservative magazines. I did a survey of general interest newspapers and magazines. In other words, probably somewhat middle of the road journalists. And I did a survey right out of basically a random selection from telephone books. So just a general interest or a general population survey. Because I wanted to see who was most close to new information and who was more sure that they were right Was there one group that's more sure that it was right or more closed to other information than another group? I theorized, for example, that contrary to the concept of dogmatism, the people at the extreme at the two extreme ends would actually be more open to considering other ideas or other information because they were more used to having to confront other information. They were on a daily basis, the general interest newspapers, the TV news, everybody that they were exposed to basically disagreed with them. And so they were used to that. Whereas on the other hand, I theorized that the people in the middle of the road, the average person, would be more closed to new information, more sure they were right because they were being reinforced by the newspapers and by the TV news and so forth. I also then thought that if I asked, engaging the strength of their opinion, that would follow how close they were to other information, that the middle of the road would actually be more sure that they were right, but I wasn't sure about that because I knew the people in the extremes were also pretty sure they were right. So that hypothesis was not real clear to me. Well, I went ahead and did these surveys, and part of the survey was, one question, for example, was if somebody offered you a free subscription to a magazine to which you disagreed politically, would you accept that subscription and read it? That sort of question did confirm my hypothesis that people in the middle of the road were more likely to say no. People in the middle of the road wouldn't want to be bothered by extremist literature. They were very comfortable going with the information they already had. Whereas the people at the extreme, the people that the sociologists said would be more likely to be dogmatic, were more open to accepting a magazine with which they disagreed and reading it. However, then I went to another part of the questionnaire, and I asked them to predict the future. I asked everybody to predict the future. One question was about economics. What do you think in the next 10 years, what do you think will happen to the economy? It'll get better, it'll get worse, it'll stay about the same. And I asked them the same thing about international relations. Specifically, what do you think will happen with the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union? This is when the Soviet Union still existed. This is in about 1978 when I did the surveys, or 1979. I can't remember exactly when I finished it. And again, will that relationship get worse, get better, stay about the same? Now, the truth is, trying to predict 10 years in the future about economics or about international relations is almost impossible. And so, the other question I asked them was, how sure are you that you're right? 30% sure that you're right, 50% sure that you're right, 80% sure that you're right. Just how sure are you that you're right about your prediction? So if you're really rational, you should be able to, I would argue that the rational conclusion would be that you probably should only be about 33% sure that you're right about trying to predict 10 years in the future about international relations or economics. But the average for every group, conservative, liberal, middle of the road, journalist, non-journalist, about, most of them were in the range of about 80% sure they were right. They're 80% sure that they were right about how they're predicting the future 10 years ahead. Well, this was kind of interesting because 10 years in the future about the US-Soviet relations meant they were all wrong, in a sense, because about 10 years later, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Now, one could argue that meant it was a lot better, but during those 10 years included the presidency of Ronald Reagan. And the Democrats claimed that Ronald Reagan was going to start World War III because he was so anti-communism. But to the contrary, Ronald Reagan helped end the Soviet Union by creating a friendship with Gorbachev. So most of us are pretty sure we're right, according to my study. No matter what our political thinking, we think we know what's right. Well, let me scoot ahead here and tell you what some of the impacts of some of these conclusions of mine. Just real quickly, there's a lot of concerns expressed in textbooks like ours. There's another one written by a professor named Barron, who is very concerned, and it's used quite widely, very concerned about the concentration of ownership, conglomeration, and so forth, hyper commercialization, things like that. But at the same time, they express concern about fragmentation. And yet those, to me, those are kind of opposites. This is from Barron's textbook. He talks about how, if you're Kellogg's, you're making cereal, you're producing Rice Krispie, you're selling it to consumers, you're going to want to make sure that you that you're creating what they want. And so his conclusion is basically NBC is the same thing. If you're NBC TV network, you're producing TV programming, you're going to respond to the audience, or perhaps to your advertisers. Is the one up here. Are you being influenced by your advertisers, or are you being influenced by your audience? But they're both part of your core, and it might be, they claim, more of the hyper commercialism. You're going to be more concerned about your advertisers than your audience. Although, like I explained earlier, you lose your audience, you're going to lose advertising. Those two go hand in hand. But they're very concerned about that. Fragmentation with the internet and with the decline of the traditional media seems to be, to me, to be the exact opposite, and it seems to be undoing a lot of those concerns. Many of the textbooks still have expressed those concerns quite strongly, even though newspapers in America are dying. They're dying badly. They've lost 60% of their advertising. They can't carry nearly as much news as they did before. They, some are closing their doors altogether. Some are basically just planning their print death. Very few of them have replaced their print advertising with significant online advertising. I would say over the next 10 years, a high percentage of the newspapers in America are simply going to die unless they can come up with a new formula to succeed commercially, succeed in business. They can't continue in any other way. So that's going to turn us more and more to information on the internet. Now, sometimes that's not necessarily good information. According to recent studies, a lot of people are getting their news from social media. Well, there's no good editor in social media. Basically, it's the social media carries almost by its very nature a lot of bias with it. And who's posting it is expressing a lot of bias one way or the other. This may tend to, if your friends agree with you, may lead to groupthink. In fact, I think there's evidence of that right now. In America, politics are polarizing. Very strong conservatives, very strong liberals, and I think that may be being caused to a large degree by, in essence, groupthink within our society, that everybody a conservative knows agrees with him, therefore he's sure he's right. Everybody a liberal knows and respects agrees with him, and therefore he's sure he's right, and they're becoming more polarized than ever in the history of America, I think. So it's going to, what's happening is it's taking power away from the traditional media, but that's not always a good thing. Another area, and I say that even though politically I disagree with most newspapers in America, most media in America. I consider myself in America conservative, and I'll come back to that concept later, and most media in America are controlled by liberals. And so even though I disagree with them, I see some negative aspects of them dying. Because although I also see that the media themselves are becoming more polarized also. So that's a whole other issue. So things are changing because of fragmentation. And for example, newspapers have been the ones in America that have done most of the investigative reporting. They're the ones who broke Watergate, for example, that broke the Watergate story, and other big stories usually have come from newspapers. TV rarely breaks investigative stories. They kind of follow along behind because they don't have very big staffs compared to newspapers, or they have not had. But now with the, like I said, with the decline at 60% of the advertising disappearing for newspapers, they can't afford to do as much investigative reporting. This has implications to our society. And I don't know, again, to what degree, I'm citing statistics from America. I'm not sure to what degree the same thing's happening in Korea or China or other places. So we were talking about how we know what we know. And I'd just like to point out that what I call, mass mediators or information mediators are themselves human beings with their own conceptual frameworks and limitations, their own influential social networks. As I mentioned, my general manager in Tampa being influenced by his social network. We have to see, in my thesis study, I wanted to go, look into this a little bit more. How, if these things that I had found in the surveys are true, how did that influence people within the media, and how did people outside the media influence people within the media? So, before I go on with that, I want to talk about some of the ideas related to it. As we are born into our society and into our culture, we begin to build within our brains, our mind, what you can call a conceptual framework. Piece by piece, concept by concept, we start to make an understanding. We begin to understand the world around us. As I said, it's very much influenced by family, culture, and so forth. We start making sense of the reality around us by building this conceptual framework. In the old days, when I was a child, there was a kind of a game. It wasn't really a game. It was kind of like a hobby set called an erector set. And it's made with a series of metal pieces with holes in them. And you had nuts and bolts, and you would bolt these metal pieces together, and you could build the Eiffel Tower. They would even, you could build a car, and you could buy a motor and put a motor in the car and drive the car, and you made it by just bolting together these pieces of metal with nuts and bolts. The conceptual framework is a little bit like that. At first, when you only have a few concepts, say you're trying to build the Eiffel Tower, and you build up some pieces, and it's kind of the right shape, but you have no crossbars. You haven't put any crossbars on yet, and this whole thing is kind of wobbly, and it's not very firm, and it could very easily fall over. And so you start putting some cross pieces up the Eiffel Tower and making it stronger. Well, our conceptual framework in our brain is kind of like that. Consequently, there was a man named Thomas Kuhn who talked about scientific revolutions in history. And what he found in his study was that science, the revolutions in science, does the earth go around the sun go around the earth, and other modern versions of this. Today, we're wrestling over, the submicroscopic elements of our existence. If you took all the space within all the atoms on Earth out. In other words, there's a lot of space comparatively between the nucleus, protons and neutrons, and the electrons. Well, if you were to blow it up, first off, you would blow it up, you would and put it would be like the nucleus would be like a ball in the middle of a soccer stadium, and the neutrons would be flying around the city outside the soccer stadium. There's a lot of space relatively between the nucleus and the electrons. In fact, it's been said that if you could squeeze all this space out of all the atoms, the whole Earth wouldn't be too much bigger than this orange, this tangerine, or this mandarin that I'm holding. It'd be the whole Earth would collapse to something that, in theory, you could hold in your hand, except it'd be way too much. And so, as scientists look at our very existence, there's confusing things about what is our existence like. When you start thinking about this, and I sometimes ask my students to think back to when they're a child, their favorite memories as a child. And so they tell me about a birthday party or something. And I ask them, were you there? And they look at me kind of strangely. What do you mean, was I there? That's my favorite memory. Of course I was there at my birthday party. I said, no, you aren't. You weren't there. Because every year, 98% of your atoms change. And so if you're thinking about something 10, 15 years ago, there's not one atom in your body, or there might be one or two atoms in your body because you might have come back. But there are very few atoms in your body that were at that birthday party. And yet, you may have a scar on your face or something. You still have it, even though your atoms are all changing all the time. You still have the same memories, even though your brain's no longer made up of the same atoms. So our very existence is questionable in lots of ways, the nature of our existence. Well, anyway, going back, we put all these things together. We have lots of conceptual limitations. We limit ourselves we're limited into our perception. We see what we expect to see in many cases. We expose ourselves to things that we are comfortable with. We don't want to expose ourselves to things that we're uncomfortable with in many cases, as I found in my survey of the general population in America. They didn't want a magazine with which they disagreed. When people start throwing ideas at us that aren't part of our conceptual framework, it creates conceptual noise, that we don't always understand it. And ultimately, if we don't understand it, we cast it out as nonsense. That's the scientific term for it. Something that doesn't fit into our conceptual framework, we throw away as nonsense. And so every journalist, every member of the audience has these limitations as what they understand and don't understand, what they can express and can't express because they don't even understand it. We all have limitations, no matter where we come from. So we think we're 80% sure we're right about the future, and yet we're very limited in our capability to understand our own reality. Okay, let's go back to this media, this communications environment we live in. There's been a study that showed that with 98% accuracy, you could predict how a congressman will vote, a member of American Congress, if you know how his three best friends are going to vote. You find the people he relates to the most, you find out how his three best friends are voting. With 98% certainty, you know how he's going to vote. So we surround ourselves by people with whom we agree to a large extent, and that becomes very predictive. It's not just because we agree with them on some things, it's that they will influence us on other things. Something new comes up. There's new things coming up in Congress all the time. And so it's not like they all agree immediately, but by the time they discuss that new bill, that new law, that whatever, they will agree. Those four people that one person and his 3 friends will agree. Okay, well, let me just skip forward just real quick and just a final thought. As this gets complicated enough, this is what I created for my thesis. That's how I pictured the world of communications, including the media. An environment of info creators like President Obama. You cannot hear me. Well, I haven't done anything. If you can't, none of you can hear me now. Interesting. Let me turn this off and back on again. Can you hear me now? Nothing in this end. I didn't do anything in this end. Okay. Well, let me just finish this because we are about out of time. So this to me is, the circles represent people. There's people in the info consumers. Frederick talked about opinion leaders, what I call info leaders, that help influence people within the audience, within the, as I was talking about before, within the media itself, the info mediators. It should have been info instead of info, but info mediators. There are some people that are opinion leaders within the media. And then you have the info creators, people like President Obama that are influencing the media and so forth. It gets very complicated. Some people have more power than others. They're more influential than others. Others kind of are purely consumers. They don't participate very much interactively in this whole process and so forth. Okay, well, I'm going to stop there. I may come back to it next week. But several things we need to do. Some of you have not chosen a chapter. I'll bring that slideshow up in a second with those that have and those who have not chosen a chapter to present. In fact, let me get to it right now, bring it up right now. If I can find it real quickly. Okay, so some of you have chosen a chapter to present and some have not. This is okay, let me go forward a little bit here. Oh, I thought I had written them in there. I did not write them in there. Oh, I wrote them in there on my desktop, not here though. Okay, but let me try to load that real quick. I think I changed it on in my computer, like I said. Okay, so while that's uploading real quickly, Facebook activity is very important. In previous semesters, the students have had 2 presentations. This semester, you only have 1. That is worth a little bit more, but we also gave more points to Facebook participation. And so it's important that you participate in Facebook. Because I will be kind of making a score every week. Every week I'm going to be checking to see who's doing it. I'm not sure that's possible. I think you need to try maybe doing it again. Facebook is pretty dependable. So try again. Some people are in. If you have a Facebook ID and if you have to come to my homepage, because the Facebook page is kind of a sub-page to my page, and befriend me as a person, and then that may then help you if you're having trouble. I think you just have to like the our class page. But if you become my friend within Facebook, it may facilitate. If you're having trouble, try that. I'm not sure what to tell you about that. I thought I had. Okay, the other thing, so you need to try to get in there. Let me know, and it kind of relates to another issue. Please email me and Frederick. My address is this, kharvey@keymep.kz. I don't have Frederick's, well, I do have it right here. Let me find it real quick. This is one of his email addresses that you can email. Send us your email address so we can talk to you directly and tell us if you're having trouble. So I need to collect your email addresses so we can communicate with you directly. Going back to here. So some of you have chosen a chapter already, but most of you have not. So please choose one of these chapters no sooner than, well, 3 would be presented next week, so that's probably too soon. So choose one of these remaining chapters that's not already chosen. And if you can do it right now, tell me here or email me what chapter you want to present. I understand. Those of you that remain, tell me what chapter you want to present if you haven't already chosen. And that's really the last thing I need to cover today. Do send me an email, so we have your email address. Try to get signed up for Facebook and participate actively, respond to each other, respond to questions we might add to it. And like I said, also tell me what you're going to present. Those are the important things we have to take care of. Okay, any questions? Anything else that I can help you with today? Again, I will be here for a few more minutes. If you want to claim a chapter now, go ahead and do it. And again, send us your email address. Thank you. And let's see, next week we don't have class, right? If I understand right, next week we skip it. We skip next week, and so we'll be back in 2 weeks. That's fine. Well, Jasoon already, well, both of them already selected one. So those, if they already left, that's okay. But any of the rest of you that are there, please tell me which chapter you want. And please confirm, do we have class next week? I don't believe we do. I'm going to turn off my my camera. Okay. I'm not sure what to tell you about that as far as why the others would stop working. Everything seemed right on my end. I did turn off my microphone and turn it back on again, thinking that might help, but that doesn't make a lot of sense from this end, and why only one computer was working on your end. but we'll see if we have problems in the future. I don't care. The problem, you can do it on Facebook. Just as soon as somebody makes a claim, lays claim to a chapter, it's theirs. First come, first serve. So whoever does not have a chapter yet, as soon as somebody lays claim to a chapter, then it's yours. So whether it's by Facebook, email, or here and now. I understand. Okay. Well, again, unless somebody wants to lay claim, class is over. Thank you.